From New Delhi to Pretoria, Brasilia to Beijing, the world economy is being driven by a new set of powers, not in Europe or the US, but in the Far East and the global South. They're known as the BRICs countries, and their economies are booming. So why are millions still stuck in poverty as their governments rack up cash? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Well, they may be booming, but some of the world's fastest growing economies are failing to improve people's lives. That's the assessment from the Institute of Development Studies in a new report published on Thursday. Researchers developed an index to measure a country's commitment to tackling hunger. Leading the pack were some of the world's poorest countries like Malawi, Guatemala and Madagascar, while economic powerhouses China, India and South Africa were among the worst performers overall. We'll hear more from the author of that study in a moment. First, let's cross to Haru Mutasa in South Africa, one of the countries singled out in the study. Thanks for being with us, Haru. Now, South Africa's economy is booming, but on the ground it is a different picture. Why?
Well, the issue here isn't the availability of food. South Africa grows a lot of it and even exports to neighboring countries. The issue here is wastage. Some supermarkets throw away piles and piles of food every day, food that is still edible, food that can still go to the needy. And then the rising cost of food prices makes it very hard for the poor to afford good, healthy, nutritious food. So they often opt for the cheaper meals often bought from fast food outlets, which are less nutritious. Hazem?
Well, you've returned as well from Malawi, I know, one of the world's poorest countries, but still being praised for its efforts to fight hunger. Just compare what you saw there to what you see in South Africa.
Well, government officials in Malawi are on a campaign to try and get rural farmers to diversify. For generations, Malawians have been growing maize, which is the staple food in that country. And farmers have been told that because of low rainfall and poor harvest, it's time now to grow other things more like groundnuts, cassava, other grains, and things like sorghum, so that if your harvest fails, for example, if there's low rainfall, you won't necessarily go hungry. You have something else to fall back on. Farmers were reluctant at first, but they seem to be slowly trying to accept this new model, growing more and more other alternatives other than maize. The key thing, of course, is to encourage Africans in sub-Saharan Africa to move away from their staple diet, be it maize in Southern Africa, in other parts of Africa, West Africa, it's other types of food. Move away from that one type of food and grow other things more often, particularly in rural areas. The Malawian government officials hope that'll work. They are aware that malnutrition levels are still very, very high in Malawi, but they are confident that one day they could deal with the problem.
Haru Mutasa in Johannesburg, thanks very much. Well, let's bring in our guest to talk more about this from Brighton, Dolf Te Lintelo from the Institute of Development Studies that authored that report. He is the lead researcher behind the Hunger and Nutrition Commitment Index. In Singapore, we're joined by Sourav Roy. He's an Asia Affairs analyst and columnist at the Huffington Post. And in Paris, we have Jon Lomoy, director at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He also served as Norway's ambassador to Zambia from 1996 to 2000. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Dolf Te Lintelo, if I could start with you, since it's your organization that put together this report. And I want to ask you, just talk us through the findings here, and in particular, how you came up with this HUNCI index, the Hunger and Nutrition Commitment Index, and what were the criteria you used to measure it?
We decided to embark on the Hunger and Nutrition Commitment Index because we noticed that globally levels of hunger and undernutrition remain stagnant or are not improving quickly enough. So at world level, we have 870 million people suffering from hunger on a daily basis. And we know that in terms of undernutrition, which affects children under 5 years of age, that annually 2.6 million children sort of die due to undernutrition related causes. So noticing that there were very slow improvements on these key development indicators, we decided to look at what is actually happening. What are governments doing to tackle these problems?
Do low levels of wealth or slow economic growth automatically imply less commitment to tackling hunger? I mean, in Africa, for example, we put up those first three countries, the smaller economies, Malawi, Madagascar, and Gambia, as being examples of countries that have led the charge against hunger and undernutrition, above a number of the other countries that have more impressive economic numbers. That's another way to look at it, isn't it?
One of the surprising findings from our study is that sort of economic growth in its own right isn't sufficient for governments to be committed to tackling hunger and undernutrition. What we did is we looked at sort of what sort of economic growth performance countries have, and we looked at the same time at what kind of policies, laws and what kind of spending they undertake in key areas that we know work towards addressing hunger and undernutrition. So surprisingly, we found that sort of it is perfectly possible for countries who actually have very low aggregate levels of wealth. For instance, Malawi, where the average sort of income is $870 per annum. In these contexts, it's perfectly possible to still be committed to do something about these problems. Whereas countries with much higher sort of income levels and with much bigger growth levels don't necessarily take these steps.
Jon Lomoy, what's your take on this? I mean, should these countries be doing much more than they are to focus on feeding the poor?
I think this is a very appropriate discussion as we are approaching 2015 and the big stock taking of what we have actually achieved in terms of the Millennium Development Goals and at the same time also start addressing our future goals. I think this report illustrates an important point that when we talk about how we're going to bring people out of poverty and out of hunger, we're talking about at least three things at the same time. On the one hand, we're talking about the need for economic transformation and economic growth. On the other hand, we're talking about the quality and character of that growth, how inclusive it is, how much employment it generates, how well distributed it is. And then we're talking about the third element, which is about the quality of public policies and how the governments, local governments, central governments can act within the policy space that they have in order to make sure that the poorest sections of the people benefit from the economic growth. And I think conceptually, and these are three different variables. I think what we see in this study is that countries perform differently on these three different areas.
Sourav Roy, are these economies invested enough in feeding their people? And I know one of your areas of expertise is in India, where we hear a lot about how India is one of these huge emerging economic powers in the world, and we hear lots of these impressive numbers on economic growth that the government likes to promote. But it is still very much also a country that is desperately poor as well.
Absolutely. I mean, while India might be showing off its GDP figures and it might just be a GDP junkie, but at the same time, the reality is that there are millions of people in India, in fact, over 1 billion in India, who still don't have access to water, sanitation, healthcare, food. And India's economic growth is a completely different story when you match it with the extreme opposite, which is the quality and the quantity of diet that millions of poor in India survive on. And that is a completely different tale of sufferings and woes. And one is often wondering, why is there no political will to sort out this matter? Why is it that millions of people in India, despite its economic growth, are still living in such a situation?
Interesting you use the term GDP junkie. Is that perhaps a reference to the motivation behind this? Is it all about coming out with impressive economic numbers to attract more foreign investment, perhaps?
What's the point of having impressive economic numbers if growth and development is not sustainable at the grassroots levels? I mean, just look at it. There are so many urban as well as rural poor in India who are struggling on a day-to-day basis, while it's just about a few million, let's say about 80 to 100 million Indians doing well. Is that enough for India? I would say no. In fact, even today, there are millions of Indian children who are suffering from stunted growth, and we've got lactating mothers and pregnant mothers who don't have access to proper nutrition, and the public policies exist on paper, but they're not implemented at the grassroots level, and the complexities are so variegated that it often is a question whether India's economic growth is sustainable or not.
Jon Lomoy, is it all about macroeconomics and economic growth at the expense of providing the basics?
Economic growth, rapid economic growth is necessary to bring millions and millions of people out of poverty. I mean, the poorest countries in the world cannot solve their poverty problem solely by redistributing what they have. They need to produce more. They need to produce more wealth so that they have more to distribute. But what I was saying earlier is the quality of this growth is important. Growth that employs more people is better. Growth that is better distributed is better. So it's about the quality of the growth. But then, in addition to that, in order for as many as possible to benefit from the economic growth, it's necessary that the government is able to tax its citizen and to use that tax money for education, for health, for water, for infrastructure and so on, to improve the livelihood of ordinary people. I think we must say that success is about success on both those two factors, both to manage to get the economy growing, but also to manage to have public policies that make sure that the benefits of that growth gets to as many people as possible.
Dolf Te Lintelo, I saw you nodding in agreement to some of that. I mean, when Jon Lomoy talks about the quality of growth, what does that mean exactly in terms of what you've seen in your study?
I think what is really important to reaffirm is that growth needs to be inclusive. Growth needs to benefit those people at the bottom of the income ladder. That is absolutely essential. You need growth, but growth needs to be exclusive and what is also further to this is critical is that we need to build mechanisms that can hold governments accountable. We need to be able to better understand what governments are actually doing with this newly gained growth, with its new resource base, using effective taxation mechanisms and then putting in place programs that benefit populations widely. And that's exactly why the Hunger and Nutrition Commitment Index is a really good tool, because it shows what governments do, what they don't do. It allows people, citizens at large, to hold governments to account. And it's not just about naming and shaming, it's also about giving praise where governments are doing things well.
Well, let's pause for a moment and look at a case study from West Africa. Nigeria's commercial capital, Lagos, is enjoying the spoils of an economic boom right now, but it's quickly becoming one of the most expensive cities in Africa, where millions are being priced out of the property market. Yvonne Dege has more.
Fidel Dio has been trying to buy a house in Abuja for more than 2 years. When he found a place he liked, he discovered that getting a mortgage was going to be difficult.
When it got to time to negotiate the whole payment process or the mortgage process, I discovered to my shock I couldn't afford it. And the reason is very simple, because I'm expected to bring 30% and pay 30% equity of the value of the house.
This housing conference in Abuja is trying to address the problems Fidel is facing. Millions of Nigerians like him want to own the homes they live in, but they can't afford to pay 30% of the asking price up front, like Fidel. They also have to pay as much as 25% interest on the loan they take, and in many cases, the money has to be paid back as soon as 5 to 10 years.
We haven't got long-term funding for the housing sector in Nigeria. That's one thing we need to address, provide long-term funding. Second is also to make houses affordable, you have to have areas where there's infrastructure. Third is our land tenure laws. The land laws in Nigeria are not very friendly towards property transactions.
This means that to buy a house in Nigeria, you pretty much have to be rich.
The 36 four-bedroom houses being built at this development will cost nearly $600,000 each to buy, when the average income in Nigeria is just over $1,000 a year.
Cheaper houses are not being built because banks won't finance them. That means 16 million homes need to be built in Nigeria just to meet demand, but only 50,000 are being constructed each year. The government says it's trying to deal with the problem, but insists it's not its responsibility to build houses.
I wouldn't say the government has failed. The ministry's responsibility is to provide policy guidelines, to provide an enabling environment for people to come in and build the houses. And that is what we have done here.
Form a word with the rest.
But Fidel blames the government. He says it should make sure there are affordable houses for everyone. Yvonne Dege, Al Jazeera, Abuja, Nigeria.
So just an idea there of the kind of inequality we're seeing in some of these countries. Jon Lomoy, I want to turn to you on this, and I want to get to the issue as well of good governance and how much of a part that plays in all of this in terms of distributing all of the wealth evenly.
I think, of course, Nigeria is a special case in some ways, since it's also a case of a country where a major part of the economy comes from petroleum, from a natural resource, and which is sort of course, creating its own pressure and its own issues about distribution. So I think the overall question that we're talking about is, of course, about quality of public policies and what is it that makes it more likely that a country can have good policies that would benefit the majority of its citizens. And clearly that's also about transparency, that's about accountability, that's about democracy. It's about having a system where the government feels accountable to its citizen and therefore has got a strong interest in delivering to its citizens.
Sourav Roy, I know this is a complicated issue and there's obviously a lot of factors at work here, and at the risk of sort of simplifying this a little bit, there is this debate that people often have, economists often have, of how to spread economic growth. There's the trickle-down approach where wealth comes down from the top, and there's the bottom-up approach. Is that a debate that you see going on here when we look at this study, that this comes down to different types of approaches to improve economic growth in countries?
Well, I see much more than that. Interestingly, we've been talking about paying taxes and about inclusive growth. It all sounds really good and hunky-dory for probably a lot of the Western economies, but when it comes to India and a lot of other Asian countries, what percentage of the people, of the population, do actually pay taxes so that it reflects into some public benefit? And as far as inclusive growth is concerned, how much of that inclusive growth is taking place or is being spearheaded by the political masters or by the bureaucracy? What unfortunately happens is that public policies are mostly populist. They're devised on the basis of vote banks and on the basis of who can come to power next in a country like India, where multiple parties are juggling and battling to storm into power. And what happens is, again, the public policies which are populist have to be delivered at the end of the day by the hand of the government, which is the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy often puts so many Chinese walls in place. And it is because of exactly these reasons that policies exist on paper, but they do not reflect in terms of development or in terms of benefit for millions of people. And if they would have actually worked, then I would have imagined a large portion of India to have moved or crossed the poverty line and at least have started the journey towards self-sustainability. That's not happening. When it comes to the question of the trickle-down effect, I cannot remember of any good example of a public-private enterprise wherein the public sector as well as the private sector combines together, forms a tag team or a truck together in order to alleviate poverty and hunger or nourishment issues. It's just not there. It's not happening. It needs to happen. Well, will it happen? We'll have to wait and watch.
Well, let's put some of that then to Dolf Te Lintelo. How much does politics play a part in all of this? The idea that too many governments are preoccupied with the next election, with staying in power, that they're not able to take a more long-term view of all this?
Well, politics are completely at the heart of any development intervention, whether populist or not. And politics need to be at the heart of these interventions as well. politics in its own right is not a wrong thing. It is important that the politics are transparent, that people can see on what basis decisions might be made. And clearly then it's part about sort of having more effective sort of governance mechanisms in place. But just to go back to India, for instance, in India we know sort of that civil society organizations are pretty good actually at holding their government to account. They have a real say in public policy, in the ways in which policies are made, and they are increasingly also looking at being critical and trying to monitor how policies are being implemented on the ground. And they're very successful in putting in place mechanisms that can actually help improve government performance. So for instance, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which was enacted in 2004-2005, now sort of gives entitlements to hundreds of millions of people to work from the government, and people can actually get and claim from their government 100 days of work a year if they need it. And as part of this package, there are mechanisms put in place like a local level social audits, which can actually make people demand this implementation from local bureaucrats. Of course, this is not happening smoothly at one go, but these mechanisms are really important in empowering people to make claims on the state and to build jointly a social contract where there's a responsibility on behalf of the state, which is able to get more taxes and get more funds through growth to redistribute and make sure that this growth is inclusive.
Jon Lomoy, is this something that perhaps has been underreported in the media? You know, when we focus on the BRICS countries, you know, as we mentioned earlier, we tend to focus on their impressive growth numbers at the expense of the inequality that is apparent in many of these countries. Should there be more reporting, more focus on what is going on at the poorest levels of societies in these countries?
First of all, I think we must avoid talking too negatively about politics. I mean, political leadership is necessary in order to have progress. And we see that good political leadership can be immensely important in transforming countries and in reducing poverty in countries. So it's the quality of politics and the content of politics. It's not sort of politics. Good politics is good and is important for countries. I think the increasing inequality in many countries of the world, both in many OECD countries but also in many emerging economies, is a growing concern. And I think we see a focus on this that we haven't seen in the past, and much more of the discussion now about growth is also, as we touched upon earlier, about what do we need to do in order to make sure that growth generates employments? What do we need to do in order to make sure that growth is more inclusive? So I think it's clearly the case that there is a very different focus on this from our side, from the side of other international organizations, and in the political debate in many countries.
Sourav Roy, just in the minute that we've got left, then what improvements would you like to see as a result of this study? I mean, what should be the focus? What are the priorities?
Well, scope for improvement is galore, but before I come to that, I'd just like to address another issue that we were talking about. The National Rural Employment Scheme in India of taking on the government for 100 days. I don't know if Mr. Lomoy has got the chance of living out that 100 days like a poor Indian does. It is absolutely difficult, and it is unimaginable to live on the wages which is given to them. I mean, one cannot just survive on the money that is doled out. Of course, the policy exists, and of course, schemes like that exist. And it's a fill in the blank in the sense that such schemes fill the blanks, but do they really work? And if yes, then are we trying to kid ourselves here that 1 billion of Indians who are still below the poverty line get a chance through that scheme? No, I don't think that happens over there. Now, what needs to change is the political will. We're talking about politics being at the heart of this situation. Well, politics is the process, but those who make this process effective are the politicians, the representatives of the people. And it is this quality, this gentry of people who need to be bold, courageous, and who need to show a leadership to actually take the right steps towards
All
it.
right, on that note, we are going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all three of our guests, Dolf Te Lintelo, Sourav Roy and Jon Lomoy. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Send us your feedback at insidestory@aljazeera.net if you want. Thanks again for watching. I'm Hazem Sika. Bye for now.